Welcome to the Dynasty Fantasy Football Show. Here's your host, Alex Klausner.
Hello and welcome to the Dynasty Fantasy Football Show, where Dynasty never sleeps. I am one of your ever faithful co-hosts, Alex Klausner, and this is the Hot Seat Index Week 2. Today, we are going to be discussing a group of coaches that are on the hot seat in the NFL. Last week's episode, I dived into why we care about this, right? And the whole thing is coaching influences everything you see on the field. The decisions that they make in the front office, the decisions that they make in coaching staffs have a direct impact on your players, their results, and how it all shakes out week to week. So, observing the status of the coaches that are in charge of your players on a week-to-week basis, very important for your success in Dynasty. We're going to dive right in and skip past our fifth tier, 5-alarm fire, where I would say the coach is at risk of being fired perhaps even this week, because simply put, there are no coaches in that tier quite yet. It is week 2. Coaching changes, just simply put, do not happen this early in the NFL. Pretty much the minimum we've seen that happen is right about week 5, week 6. And it usually will not happen to a first-year head coach. Mid-season firings are usually reserved for a second-year head coach that's struggling or a third-year head coach that isn't producing results. So that said, we're going to go ahead and skip right down to tier 4, which we call where there's smoke, there's fire. And the criteria I would put down for this one is these are the group of coaches that are at serious risk of being fired at the end of the season. And I will go through them as follows. There is Carolina Panthers head coach Dave Canales, Jacksonville Jaguars head coach Doug Peterson, Chicago Bears head coach Matt Eberflus, Dallas Cowboys head coach Mike McCarthy, New York Giants head coach Brian Daboll, and New York Jets head coach Robert Saleh, as well as Philadelphia Eagles head coach Nick Sirianni. So we got a large group here already, guys who are going to be looking out for their job status at the end of the year. Now, the first one we're going to get right into, he is a new entrant into this category. Last week I had him, I think, rated into the third or second degree of hot seat, but this week I gotta say this guy is tier 4 material, and that is Carolina Panthers head coach Dave Canales, whose Panthers lost again to the Chargers 26-3. He has an 0-2 record on the season, and frankly, here's the reason I think that this is a realistic possibility, is the fact that this guy just benched the guy the franchise drafted number 1 overall last year, 2 weeks into the season. Now, I get it. In the short term, I do think that Andy Dalton does week to week give this team a better chance to win, but benching Bryce Young, who they made such a massive investment in, is something that, frankly, you just don't see done a lot. Given the fact that they traded DJ Moore, they traded multiple draft picks for this guy, it had to work. That was the entire reason Dave Canales got this job, is because he was viewed as a guy who could come in and game plan for and fix Bryce Young based on the work that he did revitalizing Baker Mayfield in Tampa last year. However, this amounts to a stunning admission by the coach, essentially saying, I cannot do the job I was hired to do. He was hired by Dave Tepper to come in and be the quarterback whisperer and whisper to this quarterback. Now he's saying, well, frankly, I can't get it done. We've got to go with Andy Dalton. We've got to go with somebody else. I can't fix this high price asset that you have brought me in to fix. That, in a sense, is like tantamount to a resignation in week 2 of his Carolina Panthers career. I really have a hard time seeing this sit well with Dave Tepper. The only rationale I can see for Dave Canales holding on to his job beyond this season after he's benched Bryce Young is essentially that he's trying to sell Tepper on the idea that sitting Bryce Young is going to somehow improve Bryce Young's ability to play for the Carolina Panthers next year with Dave Canales again as the head coach. I don't know. I just don't see this working out. I think that Dave Canales is a serious candidate to be fired at the end of the season as a result of that move. Moving on, we have another coach who is dealing with some quarterback problems and question marks regarding his ability to get the best out of the organization's investment, and that is Jacksonville Jaguars head coach Doug Peterson, whose team just lost to Cleveland 18-13, sending the Jacksonville Jaguars now to a record of 0-2 and giving them some of the worst playoff odds in the NFL. Now, the reason why that is so bad for Doug Peterson is essentially because Shad Khan walked out at the very beginning of this season and said playoffs are going to be the expectation, and that is what we have to see and we expect the team to deliver. Well, after you've made now this $250 million investment in a quarterback whose career could probably be accurately described as mid so far. I don't want to say Trevor Lawrence is a bad quarterback because he's not, but it's not what you'd expect out of the guy you just drafted with the first overall pick in the draft, who is viewed as this generational talent, who's being paid like some generational talent. You've got to get better out of Trevor Lawrence. And again, I said it on the pod last week, right? That investment threatens Doug Peterson more than it helps him because you've made such a big investment in Trevor. Well, if Doug Peterson looks like he's the part of the equation that you need to change to get the best out of Trevor, well, Doug Peterson's going to be very much on the chopping block as a result. I think he is in one of the most dangerous situations in the NFL for getting fired. Another guy who is, again, in a dangerous situation because of the quarterback investment is Chicago head coach Matt Eberflus. Now, you see behind me, I've got some Bears memorabilia. I live in Chicago, and so I can tell you right now, things are not looking good for the Flus. He is 1-1. Yes, he is not one of those coaches who is sitting there at 0-2. But one of the things that he needed to have happen this year is to see a marked improvement in the offense's ability to move the football and score points. And it needed to really come through rookie quarterback Caleb Williams. Now, whether or not it's fair, the expectation is that Caleb was going to walk in here and be a killer. Why was that the expectation? Well, now you've surrounded him with DJ Moore, you've got him Keenan Allen, and you've got him Rome Odunze. Two of those guys have shown they can be producers in the NFL. You've got an offensive line that has first-round draft picks on it. You've got DeAndre Swift in the backfield. There are weapons around Caleb Williams. It's not like a Bryce Young situation where he can very easily go to anyone and say, well, look what they gave me. You know, they gave me a coach last year that they fired 5 games into the season, and then I'm working with an interim the rest of the time. They gave me no receivers to work with. The best guy on my team last year was like a 40-year-old Adam Thielen. You know what I'm saying? Bryce Young has a case of, well, they didn't give me anything to work with. Caleb doesn't have that excuse. The only things that you can really point to are either Caleb's struggling and he's not the generational talent that, you know, everybody says he was going to be walking into the room day one. He's got to develop into that player. Or the alternative is our offensive coordinator is not getting the best out of Caleb Williams. And Matt Eberflus interviewed 11 potential offensive coordinators this season. This is important because I think it's really important to show that Eberflus went through the process. He went through all of these guys and he said, no, this is my guy, right? Shane Waldron, out of all of these guys, is my guy. So it's not even like, oh, well, I just hired, my friend and it didn't work out. It's like, no, I really took my time. I made a considered decision. I went through the right process. And out of all of that, making that measured decision, I've come to the conclusion that it's this guy and that's my decision. And you only won your first game because the defense somehow produced like 17 points for you. You lost to Houston 19-13. And here's the problem. Okay. Caleb is not doing much better than Justin Fields had done last year. Their production looks rather similar. Their issues look rather similar. And the question then to that becomes, okay, where's that coming from? Well, the common link is Matt Eberflus and his decisions on who he hires as his offensive coordinators. And I'm telling you, they're not going to ship Caleb Williams out of town to keep Matt Eberflus around. They're going to hire a coach to come in and replace Matt Eberflus. And that is why he is in extreme danger. If Caleb Williams cannot turn it around and he cannot make the case that he is the correct man to guide this rookie quarterback to his highest potential, yeah, he's gone. Now we're going to move on to another guy who I had in this tier last week, and I considered not having him in this tier last week, but I just knew that the situation with the Dallas Cowboys was going to put Mike McCarthy firmly in the firing line if anything goes wrong. And things didn't just go wrong this week. They went really wrong. They had one of the more embarrassing losses for the Cowboys that I have seen in some time. They lost 44-19 to the New Orleans Saints, and at no point in that game was it close. Their defense was giving it up left and right. They just really struggled to get anything going to respond to that. And yeah, that's not going to reflect well on Mike McCarthy. Mike McCarthy coming into this season is coming into a lame duck contract year. I think that tells you basically everything you need to know about the organization's confidence in his ability to do this job and lead this team to its ultimate aspirations. Of course, the Dallas Cowboys, Super Bowl or bust, baby. And they are really viewing this as like an all-in year. And it's going to be do it now or sayonara. But it looks like probably what that meant was when they said we're all in is that really this isn't an all-in year. We're all in on this core of Dak and CD and Micah Parsons, but it doesn't look like they're all in on Mike McCarthy. And they shouldn't be all in on Mike McCarthy, because if they're in on this core, they need better results than that. And they need them. They need them to make the playoffs. They need them to get to the NFC Championship. And if you're losing to the Saints 44-19, maybe that's a tall order. We'll see if Mike McCarthy can hang on to his role in Dallas. Time will tell. The next guy we got to move on to is another guy who is just got a really tough quarterback situation, and that is Brian Daboll from the New York Giants. Now, Daniel Jones did actually have a game that I feel Brian Daboll might be able to point to and say, look, I'm doing the most I can with Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones actually looked respectable in this game somewhat. They did lose the game, though, to Washington 21-18. So despite the fact that Daniel Jones did make an improvement from week 1 to week 2 with Brian Daboll calling the plays now, the team is 0-2. And the likelihood of them making the playoffs is rather low. And I would just say the likelihood of them really being a competitive threat on a week-to-week basis is also low because Daniel Jones is their quarterback. How much you can really put the blame on Brian Daboll for that is up for debate, but what you cannot deny is that he is part of the decision-making apparatus that decided to keep Daniel Jones in New York. That in itself is going to be damning when it comes to reviewing his job status. So we're going to move on to the other guy in New York who is in trouble, and that is New York Jets head coach Robert Saleh. He's 1-1. He did win this week, but I just don't think any individual win, I should say, is going to move Robert Saleh out of the danger zone. He's really got to make the playoffs with Aaron Rodgers, and if he fails to do that, if he fails to make the cumulative picture be sufficient, then yeah, he is cooked. And they are going to move on because you cannot have Robert Saleh sitting there with Aaron Rodgers and all of the talent with Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson and all of that and just not make the playoffs. That's why you got Aaron Rodgers to begin with. I do think that there were some real conversations that were had about whether or not you even kept Robert Saleh for this year. But the fact that he's had to deal with Zach Wilson, the organization has essentially admitted that drafting Zach Wilson was a mistake. I think they're willing to give him a chance, but that chance has to mean playoffs, and it has to mean that now. The other guy totally under that playoffs or bust scrutiny, who we're going to round out tier 4 with, because I do think that this guy may not entirely fully deserve to be here, and that is Philadelphia head coach Nick Sirianni. And the reason I say that Nick Sirianni may not deserve to be here is because had Saquon Barkley just caught the football, then I think we're talking about Nick Sirianni being 2-0 as opposed to 1-1 and leading what looks like one of the tougher, better teams in the NFL. We did see some nice things out of Jalen Hurts this game. Seeing improvement out of Jalen Hurts in the new offense does kind of bode better for Sirianni's prospects. And like I said, if he was sitting on that 2-0 record right now, I'd be much more willing to say we're going to downgrade him into tier 3. But the fact that they lost that game because Saquon Barkley dropped the ball essentially creates this thing of you lost because of clock management. And that ultimately falls on the shoulders of the head coach. It's one thing to say, okay, well, I don't have the horses, right? I don't have the talent to compete in a game. But it's another thing to say, well, we're losing games because of my clock management. The Philadelphia Eagles are not going to tolerate anything less than absolute excellence from the head coaching position, because they believe that they have absolute excellence on the roster, and they view that this is a Super Bowl window. If they at some point in this season make the decision that Nick Sirianni is not going to get them back to the Super Bowl, then he will be cooked and they will move on and they will find someone that they think can do that. Now, we're going to move on to our next tier of coaches, which I call Disney World in July. So all of these guys are down in Florida in the middle of July right now, experiencing that sweltering heat mounting, but things aren't quite on fire yet. Okay. It's hot, but it's not that hot. What we're going to be talking about is coaches that probably are looking over their shoulder at this point, but can at least breathe a little easier. Maybe the temperature is cooling off just a little bit for some of these guys, or maybe it's rising for some of these guys. We'll talk about who's rising, who's falling. We'll start with a faller, a guy who had a good week. He's fallen out of tier 4 and into tier 3. So he's kind of moving on down that tier. That will be New Orleans Saints head coach Dennis Allen. Okay. Now, before I dive into Dennis Allen, sorry, I forgot to read out the tiers. So here comes the tiers. Let's get that graphic up. All right, so we've got in this tier just Dennis Allen, the New Orleans Saints, Cincinnati head coach Zach Taylor. We've got Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton and Buffalo Bills head coach Sean McDermott. All right, back to Dennis. Okay, so this week we talked about Mike McCarthy, right? Now we're going to talk about the guy that beat him, and that is Dennis Allen. He beat Dallas 44-19, raising this team's record to 2-0. Now, why I think that this is important to note. Dennis Allen now stands among the guys with the best opportunity, best chances of making the playoffs at the end of the year. The New Orleans Saints are playing in a division with the Carolina Panthers and the kind of TBD Atlanta Falcons. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers definitely look like the team that probably will own that division. But the New Orleans Saints, I mean, they look really tough. Now, one of the things that is really important to note as well is they have an offensive coordinator named Clint Kubiak, who's brought in at the beginning of this year kind of to help resurrect the performance of Derek Carr. And Clint is doing a great job. The Saints have scored on every single one of their offensive possessions. Say it with me. The New Orleans Saints have scored on every single offensive possession this year. That is an insane statistic through 2 games. And just the fact that they look so dominant through these 2 games, I think is really beginning to cool off some of the heat on Dennis Allen. It's beginning to give this fan base a sense of kind of hope that he can be a leader that can go out there and dominate other teams. I was willing to look at Carolina and say the Carolina Panther victory that they had last week where they beat Carolina. I was willing to look at that and say, okay, well, you beat Carolina 47-10. Who cares? It's Carolina. But when you're beating Dallas 44-19, and again, this was not a close game, I really think that that says a lot about this team. Now, whether or not this is really Dennis Allen or whether or not this is Clint Kubiak, that's a discussion we should probably have, right? One of the things that I do think is possibly a risk for Dennis is Clint's success, actually, because there is a real chance that the New Orleans Saints could look at him and say, you know what? We got to keep this guy in the building. And how much do we really, really like Dennis Allen? And how much success can we believe that Dennis Allen will have without Clint Kubiak? That is a possible risk for him, especially given, again, the way that he entered this season on such a hot seat and with such high kind of playoff or you're gone kind of vibes around him. So that's just something to take note of. Now we have another guy who's kind of risen himself into this column through and tier through just some abysmal performances so far this year, and that is Cincinnati head coach Zach Taylor, whose team is 0-2, starting slow. Now, typically, Cincinnati has a history of slow starts. Joe Burrow does kind of tend to warm up. They haven't had T. Higgins on the field. Jamar Chase, there's a lot kind of going on with him. And it's also important to remember that this team did take did take Kansas City right down to the wire and just lost by a single point to Patrick Mahomes. I mean, no shame in that. You did play Kansas City very close, but that 0-2 start really puts the Bengals in a precarious position where it becomes very statistically unlikely that they will make the playoffs. When you're paying Joe Burrow the kind of money that you're paying him, missing the playoffs is not really going to be an acceptable result. I think that last year there was a lot of goodwill being given to Zach Taylor because of the performance of Jake Browning as the backup quarterback in Joe Burrow's absence. And people were saying, okay, well, Zach Taylor can clearly affect the quarterbacks well, and he can get the most out of quarterbacks. But there is an expectation that with Joe Burrow, you're going to be in the playoffs, right? And just keep an eye out if Zach Taylor misses the playoffs, that Cincinnati could look at that and say, we kind of need more out of the massive investment that we're making in this quarterback. And I could really see that given the fact that the Cincinnati is not a team that traditionally is like a big spending team. The owners there are among the poorer, or at least more just like stingy, I guess you could say, owners in the NFL. The Cincinnati Bengals franchise is just not traditionally a rich one. And so, with the fact that they are paying the big money to Joe Burrow, I think that there are just going to be some added pressures from ownership to make sure that investment returns. Now, speaking of owners and their cash, we are going to talk about another guy in Sean Payton, who I didn't really necessarily know where to put him, if I should put him in tier 2 or tier 3, but we're going to talk about him in tier 3, and I'm going to get into the reason why. The reason why is, even though Sean Payton does have a $20 million a year contract, and it's not very easy necessarily to buy that out, and even though, he did just draft Bo Nix and all of that, the reason I think Sean Payton is in more danger than you may expect is largely due to the team's ownership situation. So the thing you got to know about the Denver Broncos is they are owned by members of the Walton family. The Walton family, Walmart, okay? They've got a lot, and I mean more money than God. Money. They have got so much cash to do essentially whatever they want with. Now, there's a salary cap. They can't just go out and buy all the players, but what they can do is they can make huge, huge offers to whatever coach they want. Okay. And they did that with Sean Payton. After Nathaniel Hackett was fired, they hired Sean Payton. And the reason they did it was because Sean Payton was supposed to come in and fix Russell Wilson. So now the fact that you've got Sean Payton supposed to come in and fix this quarterback, well, guess what? He couldn't do it. And guess what? They ended up cutting that quarterback, and they're paying him essentially $60 million to play for an opponent because Sean Payton said they should. And Sean Payton went out there and he said, okay, no, you got to get rid of that guy. No, because I can't work with him. I need Bo Nix. Bo Nix is going to be our answer. Okay, well, if you're the kind of guy like Sean Payton who walked into the room with a decade of experience in the NFL, Super Bowl rings, on your fingers, I'd be willing to listen to that if I was the owner. But at the same time, when I'm paying a quarterback $60 million to play for a team that plays in my conference, let me tell you, I'm going to be expecting a lot out of the coach to deliver on what he promised would happen if I said, okay, we're going to get rid of that guy. We'll get your guy. You're going to deliver me wins. Cool. They're 0-2. Their offense looks terrible. Bo Nix essentially looks like Kenny Pickett out there right now. He just is really struggling to adjust his game to the caliber of play that you need to go win at the NFL level. Look, I know they had a tough matchup with Pittsburgh this week. I don't debate that. I understand. But again, when you are in a results-based business and you are telling the owner, hey, go pay this ridiculous contract to hire me, trade your first round pick to hire me, get rid of this quarterback, $60 million, bring in this first round quarterback that I want, he's terrible. I'm looking at that going, okay, what am I paying you for? What am I paying you for? Am I paying you to lose 70-20 to the Miami Dolphins? Am I paying for that? $20 million? I really think that the results just are not working out with Sean Payton in Denver. I'm not sure what it is with Denver. I do think that there's just something going on maybe at the front office level between the ownership and the coaches, within their front office, their scouting, whatever it is. there is something that is preventing them from enjoying the success that they really should have. And they've got to figure it out. And it's going to be on their owners to kind of get all of that sorted out. But I do think that there are starting to be some questions swirling around Sean Payton, his job status. Now we're going to move on to another Sean. Now, this guy, I had him in the tier 4 column because it's kind of serious risk of getting fired. And I do still think that there are extremely high expectations on this coach. And there are reasons why we should be looking out for him to get fired, even if they make the playoffs. It is all going to depend on how the playoffs go. But this is Sean McDermott from the Buffalo Bills. His team beat Miami handily, 31-10. And I mean, is one of those things I was talking about. That Dallas game is like, if you watch that game, wasn't close. It was a blowout. And Sean McDermott's defense, which he is known for, was really at the forefront of that. I think he has done a great job kind of bringing this team away from the kind of air it out, have Josh Allen throw a million times to Stephon Diggs kind of football, and brought them back to a really kind of fundamentally sound brand of football that's, with their talent, is helping them win a lot of games. They're playing really disciplined. You're not seeing Josh Allen be quite as reckless on the field there. A lot of running with James Cook. I thought it was a really impressive game, and a reason why I'm willing to downgrade him out of that look for him to get fired at the end of the year thing, because at the end of the day, if they keep looking like this, if they keep winning games that handily, with that level of physicality, with that level of dominance, just pummeling the will out of opponents, A, they're going to be hard to beat, and B, they're going to get a lot of wins, and they'll probably, let me tell you, look really good in the playoffs. If they play that brand of football, that gets you far in the NFL playoffs. All right, now we're going to move into tier 2, one of my favorite titled categories, which I call Nelly Singin, because it's getting hot in here. All right, please don't copyright strike me, YouTube. Okay, so this is tier 2. Here are the coaches in this tier. We've got Pittsburgh Steelers Mike Tomlin. We've got Tennessee Titans Brian Callahan. We've got Miami Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel. And we've got the Cleveland Browns Kevin Stefanski. Now, some of you guys might disagree with a couple of the inclusions there. Mike Tomlin is a guy who I actually previously had in the 3rd tier, Disney World in July. But right now, Mike Tomlin is now sitting at 2-0. He has some of the highest odds to make the playoffs. And the way that Mike Tomlin works, you almost know that with a 2-0 head start, that guy is probably going to finish with his typical no losing season. You know, his team might be a wild card in the playoffs, always just kind of sneaking in there. I really see Pittsburgh just continuing to stay patient and steadfast with Mike Tomlin. His brand of football is Pittsburgh's brand of football. The ownership seems to really like him despite the fan base. And you know that these are the most patient owners in the NFL. And with Mike Tomlin's track record of success, even if the results are still kind of middling, if he is on that playoff bubble, they are just not going to make a move. The only way they are going to make a move to fire Mike Tomlin is really if this team bottoms out. And while that's still possible, I just don't see that really happening because it's Mike Tomlin. And we've seen him do this time and time again. And so as he's moving to 2-0, I think it's just becoming more of like, we can kind of take him out of that top level firing conversation. Now, a guy who kind of moved up into that this week was Brian Callahan from the Tennessee Titans, who lost to the Jets 24-17. Now, I don't really see him getting fired this year. Again, he's a first-year head coach. He was brought in essentially, I think, to help bring the Tennessee Titans into the 21st century. Mike Vrabel is a head coach. He was not a big fan of things like analytics and things like, modern scouting and PFF and those kinds of things. He had a very old school way of playing football and also a very old school way of running his operation behind the scenes. And so I think Brian Callahan, in large part, was kind of brought in to help modernize the infrastructure of the Tennessee Titans with new general manager Ran Carthon. And so I do think that he's safe. But also, one of the reasons that Brian Callahan was brought in is because his job right now is to coach quarterback Will Levis. Now, Will Levis is a guy with immense upside. He's also a guy who has shown immense downside. We've seen, frankly, two very, very reckless plays that cost the team be executed by Will Levis on the football field. We're talking just Carson Wentz level Looney Tunes crazy plays that are inexplicable. I was willing to kind of write off the first one as, okay, it's a rookie mistake. Like, he's trying to play a little hero ball and he's trying to make a play for his team. I can forgive that. Just let's not see any more of that. But then you come back the next week and make almost the exact same kind of mistake, and with, predictably awful results. I just think that, first of all, I can tell that Brian Callahan is pretty much done with Will Levis after 2 games, similar to Bryce Young, but he's not benching him. And I do think, though, that that's going to be kind of a strike against Callahan, because one of the things that you were brought in to do is bring this quarterback's level of play up. And what are we doing? Okay, let's go on to the next one. And that is, again, a guy that I might say is a controversial choice for this column, which is Miami head coach Mike McDaniel. Now, his team lost to the Bills 31-10. And in this game, we saw Tua Tagovailoa go down with the dreaded concussion, right? You're probably going to ask me, how are you going to put that on Mike McDaniel? I'm not going to put that on Mike McDaniel. I don't think that's necessarily his fault. But one thing that we have to consider is that Mike McDaniel, throughout his tenure in Miami, has been vouching for Tua Tagovailoa and has really been one of Tua's biggest allies in the building. There's a couple things to consider here. The first being, McDaniel is part of the decision-making apparatus that essentially gave Tua Tagovailoa this massive quarterback contract, some on the level of like your Trevor Lawrences, your Joe Burrows, et cetera, et cetera. So they're paying Tua Tagovailoa a lot of money. And I think that one of the things that you have to consider was that the concussion aspect of Tua was well known before you gave him that contract, right? So I do think that there's an ownership thing here that you're going to have to watch out for. 3 factors. First one, McDaniel has vouched for Tua, right? And so basically, let's say the Tua thing doesn't work out. Tua retires, ends up costing the team money. Basically, that's kind of going to come back on you a little bit. That's going to come back on the GM. That's going to come back on you. It's like the Daniel Jones thing in New York. It's like when that goes badly and you take those risks on your guys like that, well, we've seen that can maybe not work out in some guys' favor. So the question is how much is McDaniel really going to regret vouching for Tua at the end of the day when Stephen Ross is making his decisions? Stephen Ross is really the other factor here. And while I know Mike McDaniel is an extremely popular coach, people seem to like him. Everybody seems to like him. He's beloved by the media. The players seem to like him. And so point being is that I think that like everybody can agree that we all like Mike McDaniel. The question is how patient is Stephen Ross going to be? And especially if the offense keeps looking like that with Tua in the game. The thing that we have to say is that Tua played until the 4th quarter, and they were getting blown out even then with Tua on the field. And Mike McDaniel ultimately is going to be responsible for shepherding this operation and getting Tua Tagovailoa back to the playoffs and over the hump and deeper into the playoffs. That is going to be the expectation here. And so I do think there's an element of the pressure is going to start to mount on Mike McDaniel. I do think he'll probably be forgiven ultimately at the end of the day for anything that happens with Tua Tagovailoa this year. But next year, I definitely do think that you got to kind of maybe watch out for it a little bit. And it's just something I think we're going to continue to monitor as this season goes on is how does McDaniel's offense look with Skylar Thompson? When does Tua get back in there? How much blame does the front office kind of put on him for that? And the other thing you just got to remember is if Sean Payton comes free, that is going to mess things up for Mike McDaniel, because one of the things that we know or have heard through the grapevine essentially is that there was a concerted effort by Miami Dolphins owner Stephen Ross to get Sean Payton to Miami when he was still on contract with the New Orleans Saints. There were some tampering allegations. They lost draft picks over that. So if Sean Payton ends up getting fired by the Denver Broncos, now I'm not sure if you're going to fire Mike McDaniel and bring in Sean Payton if he gets fired from the Denver Broncos, but I'm just saying that, owners have a weird way of just kind of doing whatever they want because they're rich and they can. So he could very well just buy out McDaniel's contract and hire his old buddy Peyton if he wants to. I don't see him wanting to, but that could happen. Just something to keep in the back of your mind as this Mike McDaniel situation evolves. We're going to move on lastly to the guys the bottom of tier 2. This is Kevin Stefanski, who beat the Jaguars 18-13. I'm not going to get too deep into this one, but I'm just going to say, yeah, you won this week. Deshaun Watson did look a little better, but I'm just saying as long as Deshaun Watson is the quarterback and Jimmy Haslam is your owner making decisions, things will be weird and things will be difficult. Okay. So now we're going to get into my Fonzie tier. That is going to be tier 1. We got a lot of coaches in here. These are the guys that you can just basically say are firmly safe. We're going to talk about a few of them because there's some movement either to this level or guys that might be kind of in some weird spots. But let's dive into the list first. We got New England's Gerard Mayo. We've got Las Vegas's Antonio Pierce. We got Baltimore's John Harbaugh. Indianapolis's Shane Steichen. Arizona's Jonathan Gannon. Houston's DeMeco Ryans. Los Angeles Chargers Jim Harbaugh. Kansas City's Andy Reid. Detroit's Dan Campbell. Green Bay's Matt LaFleur. Minnesota's Kevin O'Connell. Washington's Dan Quinn. Los Angeles Rams Sean McVay. San Francisco's Kyle Shanahan. Seattle's Mike McDonald. And Tampa Bay's Todd Bowles. Now we're going to talk about the guys kind of more toward the top of that list. We're going to lead off with Gerard Mayo. They lost to the Seahawks 23-20. His team is sitting at 1-1, but I am moving him into the firmly safe category. I had him in a 2 last week because I thought replacing Belichick with this roster was going to be a real danger for him. But he's a first-year head coach, and every week, first of all, we've seen him go out and get a close win. Now we saw him just suffer a very close competitive loss. The way his team has performed the past couple weeks, you can see they are scrappy, they are physical, they are tough, and they are going to hang in the game with you. Actually, I've been really impressed with Gerard Mayo's performance so far. I think New England fans probably are going to feel the same. And we're going to say Gerard Mayo is probably going to survive year 1. Week 1, definitely. Year 1, we'll see. Most likely. Okay. Antonio Pierce, Las Vegas. They beat the Ravens 26-23, moving him to 1-1 on the year. One of the things that we saw happen for Antonio Pierce over this offseason was the reason he got the job is because the players really wanted him there. And they showed last year that they were willing to play hard for him. And the reason why I thought Antonio Pierce might be in danger is the quarterback room. But this week we saw Gardner Minshew can get the ball to Devontae Adams, and he himself can play some really efficient football in this offense and get them wins that maybe you wouldn't expect them to get. Like, how many of you, raise your hand, thought the Ravens were going to beat the Raiders this week? You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think that the thing that you got to say for Antonio Pierce is the players are playing hard for him. That has definitely borne out. And I think that you can really see that this is going to be, like Gerard Mayo's team, a very scrappy, physical team that's going to get tough wins and is going to play hard all year. I think he is moving himself into tier one, especially because this is his first full year as the head coach. I just do not see Mark Davis being willing to make so many coaching changes year over year over year like that. I think they're trying to let this Antonio Pierce thing kind of play out. So another guy that is still in the Fonzie tier, but is definitely going to be possibly on watch to move up if he starts to go 0-3 is Baltimore's John Harbaugh. He is one of the only coaches in the NFL that's been tenured since the 2000s, the other one being Pittsburgh's Mike Tomlin. And there's a reason for that, because John Harbaugh is a great head coach and he gets great results. But right now, the results are not so good. He's sitting at 0-2. He's had some tough losses. His team's been in it till the end. It's just been, those game of inches type of losses where it's like, man, we're just this close, this much of a play away. And so I don't necessarily think that John Harbaugh is really in much danger yet. But if those losses start mounting, if he goes to 0-3, 0-4, I do think questions are going to start arising about whether or not he really is the best guy to get this team where it believes it belongs, which is in the Super Bowl, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think that John Harbaugh, if you fired him, that would be a huge mistake. And I'm not advocating for that, but I am saying that you are going to see maybe just the rumor mill start churning a little bit if there is more losses to come. So next, we're going to talk about another 0-2 coach, that is Shane Steichen. I don't think Shane's in any real danger. I've got him in the Fonzie tier, but 0-2 is not a fun place to be. And you are going to need to show that you can get better out of Anthony Richardson. Yes, he is raw, but the whole reason this organization, I think, had Shane Steichen to begin with is because they see that Anthony Richardson has the potential to be this great dual threat quarterback in the NFL. Shane Steichen has gotten that out of Jalen Hurts, and they're going to be expecting that kind of magic out of the investment they placed in Anthony Richardson. So the pressure is on for Shane Steichen to get Anthony Richardson to stop having games like the one he just had, where he's turning the ball over a lot and he's looking like he's having trouble processing the jump to the NFL. We've talked a lot about Anthony Richardson and his experience level on the podcast in general. But Shane Steichen is going to have to kind of eliminate the kinds of mistakes that you'd expect from somebody with Anthony Richardson's experience level, because again, this is a results-based business and the results right now are not what you want. 0-2 is not a fun place to be. So we will close this out with a guy who moved, I think, himself firmly into the category of Fonzie, and that is second-year head coach Jonathan Gannon, whose Arizona Cardinals just defeated the Rams 41-10. And I do not care probably like what you do the rest of the season. When you have a game like that where you punk Sean McVay that badly on the football field, that's pretty impressive. Jonathan Gannon was a guy that we made fun of a lot. Last year he had the shoo, shoo, pew, pew, kind of thing. And the, who took the bus? Who drove here? Motivational speech. And we all thought like this guy's like the Michael Scott of the NFL. Well, it turns out, the Michael Scott of the NFL might have something to him, just like Michael Scott was actually a really talented salesman because of his antics. Jonathan Gannon apparently is connecting with his players and he's getting them to play, I think, at above and beyond level of their talent on a week-to-week basis. This is a really impressive coach and coaching job that he has been doing in Arizona. I'm becoming a fan. I'm becoming won over, and I'm putting him in the one category right now. I really don't think there's really any danger of him getting fired. I think that Arizona kind of knows what it is, which is kind of a rising team. They're a team that, is in a long-term rebuild, and they're kind of in year 2 of that. And I think that their understanding of themselves is hopefully what will lead them to long-term success. Kind of like the Lions, right? If the Lions had sat there and said, okay, yeah, Dan Campbell isn't really winning in year 1 or 2, but we're going to get rid of him. This isn't working fast enough. Well, then you wouldn't have gotten what you got year 3, and I think, Zach Taylor was another case for patience, where Zach Taylor's first 2 years I thought were really, really bad. And I hope he's not trending back in that direction, because his year 3 was really, really good, and he kind of, I think, made a great case for maybe you want to keep your coach for these 3-year windows. You don't want to just make a snap judgment in year 1 or year 2, like a lot of us do. Listen to me. Hey, guilty right here, right? So like, I do think that regardless of what happens this year, I really hope they give Jonathan Gannon his 3rd year to produce more results, because I think that he's really got something cooking. And I think that this is a team that you're talking about with just like a few more additions of talent, a few more infusions of draft picks, free agents, things like that. I think they could be really, really competitive in their division. So that will wrap it up for us today. If you made it to the end of this episode, well, I just want to say thank you so much, and say you're a real one. All right. This is an independent podcast. So if you like what you heard, please rate it on whatever you're listening to. Give us 5 stars on Apple. If you like the information you're getting here, you think this is useful to you. Yell at me in the comments if you think it's not useful, or you think it sucks, or I'm wrong. Go ahead and follow us on social media. Yell at us there too. We always like to talk about football. That's why we're doing this. So the more we can interact with you guys about football, the more fun we're going to have, right? And the more fun you're going to have, because, hey, this is fun, right? Who's got it better than us? And with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening to the Dynasty Fantasy Football Show, Hot Seat Index. This is where Dynasty never sleeps. And on that note, I'll see you all again on Monday when we do our Week 3 Sunday big show. Talk to you all later.